Hello everybody, I'm Silleaf. This will be part 1, chapter 1 of Through the Eyes of a Quirkless Child, written by Withering Apollo on AO3. Summary. Midoriya Izuku is, arguably, the most self-sacrificial person on the planet. So really, it's no surprise when he forcibly takes Bakugo's place in the hands of the League of Villains during the training camp. But what will the League do when a bit too much of Midoriya's past is brought to light? How will they handle a child so broken he doesn't see how damaged he is? Despite what everyone seems to think, Midoriya Izuku was not stupid. Self-sacrificing, maybe, but a sharp analytic mind was often overlooked. After all, the next symbol of peace ought to be the perfect hero. Brave, strong, a shoot first, ask questions later kind of person. Just like All Might. It had taken him so long to even develop his shoot style, and he still has barely separated himself from the number one hero's legacy. He still ignored his logical brain to run headfirst into every situation, not allowing himself to stop and think before a fight. If he did, he would risk tarnishing All Might's image. Not that anyone knew of his connection to the pro hero, but still. Izuku could not afford to be himself. That was a lesson he knew very well. His beloved Kacchan had beat it into him every day for years. How could he forget? So instead of being Midoriya Izuku, he was Deku, the brave, strong hero who saved people with a smile. His friends and enemies alike called him by the childhood nickname. It became more than just a simple mask he put on during a hard fight. It became what was expected of him, what was required of him. The only one who really seemed to care about his health was Recovery Girl, but her voice alone was not enough to change the world. Her almost motherly concern for him could not hold back villains, could not change his mind of his mentor. No matter how many times she told him to be more careful and scolded All Might for putting him in life-threatening situations, nothing would change. The world would depend on his ability to break himself, piece by piece, and keep on fighting. The world relied on Deku. No one needed Midoriya Izuku. But it's not like he was needed in the first place. Midoriya Izuku was little more than a burden, so it was better for that name to be stored away, shoved beneath years of burns, biting laughs, and cruel words. As far back as he could remember, he was useless. He meant nothing to anyone. His own mother could hardly meet his eyes most days, and when she did, it was a look of regret and barely concealed shame. Teachers watched on with blank expressions as he was beaten into the ground, thrown into the air, burned, stabbed, abused. School nurses would scold him for riling up students with powerful quirks. He should know by now how fragile he is, how weak. He would limp home through back alleyways after school, trying to avoid the groups of kids waiting outside the gates for him. Poorly bandaged cuts and burns with nowhere near enough healing cream became a staple in Izuku's life. It's not like he was complaining, he was asking for it after all. A lot of the time he didn't keep his head down. He would answer questions in class, offer to help other students with their homework, or try to sit in the cafeteria during lunch. All those things were a clear provocation. He was practically begging to be beaten. And he was. He was beaten down more times than he could count, by Bakugo, by the staff at school, by the distance of his own mother, by All Might himself saying he couldn't be a hero without a quirk. It became almost soothing. If he couldn't count on anything else, he could count on the uselessness. He could rely on the hatred and disgust of others. But now, that needed to change. Everyone was depending on him. He needed to rely on his own strength, even if it killed him. He would not let any of his classmates suffer. He would save every last one of them, and he would do it with a smile. There was no other option, no choice to be made. Even if Kacchan would never admit it, he needed Izuku right now too. And Izuku would die before letting down his friends, the people who were relying on him to save the day with a determined grin. If All Might couldn't be there, Deku would be. So he ran. He ran past trees, past fires and smoke. He tuned out the maniacal laughter of unseen villains. He had to keep going. He didn't slow down, not for a moment. Branches tugged harshly at his broken arms, limbs at his sides. Leaves whipped at his face. If he were to think back on the memory in the future, he would honestly say he didn't know where he was going. All he knew was that he had to find the League. The screams, the laughter, and explosions began to die down. If he didn't get Kacchan now, he couldn't even think about it. There was no time to worry about possibilities, no time to think of a plan. His brain needed to be shut off. He would save Kacchan. There was no way he would let someone with so much potential be taken into the hands of the League of Villains. Midoriya Izuku was locked away, somewhere far from the surface. Midoriya Izuku couldn't save Kacchan. But Deku could. Deku would. Izuku pushed through the leaves, coming to a stop in a clearing above all the rest of the carnage. He was right about the League preparing to make their exit. He noted a handful of villains he didn't recognize. One with black hair and gruesome purple scars, seemingly held together by staples like a patchwork doll, was looking over the burning forest with something that could only be described as a nasty blend of pride and smugness. Just as he began to look around at the other villains, a loud crash drew his attention away from them, who still hadn't noticed him somehow. A tall figure in a gaudy yellow jacket and a top hat had fallen through the trees, as if being chased. The figure, a magician perhaps, cleared their throat awkwardly before standing up to their full height, only a few inches taller than Izuku, but the top hat and lawn jacket made the person all the more imposing and extravagant. Just as the magician backed away from the tree line, a group of Izuku's classmates burst into the clearing. Absently, he noted how worn down and frantic his classmates seemed. His ears were ringing, still catching his breath from the high-speed hunt he had been on for Kacchan. Despite this, he heard muffled yelling and furious demands to "Give him back, villain!" It only took Deku a moment to catch up with what was happening. And then he saw Kacchan appear out of seemingly nothing. And just like that, it was decided. The villains would die if they didn't step aside. Because he had tried to take Kacchan, they had put that shocked and vaguely distant look on his face. And so, for this, they would suffer. Before he could even put together a rational thought, Izuku lunged forward as Bakugo was pulled back into a purple void. If he had stopped to think, he would have realized just how bad of an idea this was. But Deku was not one to step down from saving a person who needed him, no matter how much that person hated him. Midoriya Izuku might have been stopped, might have weighed the pros and cons of letting Bakugo be taken by the villains, but Deku didn't hesitate. He couldn't afford to breathe, to think. His Kacchan needed to be saved. It was as if he was watching his body move from behind a TV screen, like this was some sick horror action film and not real life. Izuku watched his shattered red-purple arm reach forward and grab onto Bakugo's wrist with an iron grip. He watched his beaten-down body twist Bakugo out of the portal, and he watched as his grip failed at the last moment. Purple mist swallowed him whole, but not before he watched Kacchan run towards him with a near-feral look on his face. Just like that, his head snapped backwards as he landed flat on his back, on the other side of the portal. He registered a sickening thud, crack, and he was out cold. On the other side of the portal, a small group of Class 1A watched as Deku whipped Bakugo out of the League's grasp. They watched Bakugo rush the portal, reaching out for their injured classmate, only to close his hands on thin air, falling on his hands and knees where Deku had been not a half-second before. A few of them screamed for their friends, and others tried to rush the portal themselves, just as it closed. It was as if the world itself came to a grinding halt. The fire stopped crackling in the forest, the slight summer breeze dying down as it, too, halted in its tracks. No one dared to make a sound. If they were to speak, they would have to confront what they just witnessed. Maybe if they stood silently where they had been as Deku fell into the claws of the League, he would come back. Maybe. But the moment was broken as quickly as it began. The hero classes had begun to gather at the clearing, seeking out teachers and peers as the villains left. No one knew who exactly asked, "Where's Deku?" first, but as soon as they did, the students who hadn't witnessed the fateful events began to panic. After all, everyone was more than familiar with Midoriya Izuku's reputation as the problem child of 1A, seeming to draw in villains like a magnet. The group fell into a frenzy, each asking everyone they knew if they had seen Deku. Some had seen him go off to find Koda. Some had seen him run past in the forest not 15 minutes before. The students fell silent as Aizawa commanded their attention, and began to relay to them just what had taken place. Bakugo had yet to move, seemingly frozen in place. Some students began to cry. Some laughed uncomfortably. Obviously, Aizawa-sensei was just pulling another one of his logical ruses. And some just glanced at their teachers with disbelieving looks. All of it took for the reality of the situation to set in was Bakugo standing slowly on shaking legs. He turned to his peers, looking through them with a hauntingly empty stare. His distress was betrayed, however, by the tears still rolling down his cheeks. Without saying a word, Bakugo walked through the group of students and sat beside Kirishima. By this point, most of the students were either in shock or desperately trying to muffle their hysterical sobs. Uraraka had already thrown up, Ida kneeling beside her on the ground as he rubbed her back soothingly. They had no way of knowing what the League was going to do to Deku, but considering how badly they had injured a few of the students and pro-heroes, it couldn't be good. Images of torture devices and Deku strapped, unconscious, to a metal table flew through the students' minds. By the time EMTs arrived, sirens piercing through the night, a handful of students had already made up their mind to rescue Midoriya, at any cost. They would not let their friends suffer, and more than one of his friends were already planning on how best to kill every last member of the League, to make them regret ever laying a finger on him. Rising to their feet as ambulances pulled into the dirt road by the clearing, Uraraka had a crazed grin on her face, a look they had only seen before the sports festival, and even then, nowhere near as unhinged as this. Beside her, Ida looked almost normal. There was only one person who would recognize that look, the one he wore every day leading up to the Hosu incident, and that person was currently in the clutches of the League of Villains. Students and heroes alike were taken through an assembly line of ambulances, starting by assessing their physical states, then their mental states, and finally ending with them giving a statement to the local police. A few students were too far in shock to give a statement, rather being told to sit beside the mental health counselors at one of the ambulances until they could be taken to a hospital for proper evaluation. The teenagers were dead silent, aside from a few whispering comfort to each other on the other side of the road. Aizawa was the first to give his statement, naturally. He stood to the side by the police cars, carefully watching over his students, giving their side of the story, placing a reassuring hand on their shoulders as they walked past. To most, this would seem like a minimal amount of affection, considering what the kids had gone through in the past few hours. But the students recognized just how big of a statement it was for someone like Aizawa. The only other time he had made physical contact with them, outside of training, was just after the USJ, particularly Sue. He had been more than a little nervous in their first training exercise after the League's debut, and it certainly didn't help when Sue took a hard hit and fell flat on her back. Before she could even begin to stand, Aizawa was at her side. His eyes flitted around nervously as he skidded to a stop beside her, kneeling. He took longer than he probably needed to in order to check her over, only calming down when he knew she was uninjured, aside from a few bruises and a cracked rib. He personally carried her to Recovery Girl, sitting anxiously at her side as she healed. After she was in perfect health again, Sue made sure to assure Aizawa-sensei that she wouldn't say anything about it to her classmates. Ever since then, he was a little quicker to ruffle her hair, a little quicker to tell her she did a good job on an assignment, or during hero training. Aizawa's tough exterior could only hide so much of his mushy, parental nature. So it didn't particularly surprise anyone when Sue sat quietly beside him after she had given her statement, looking tired but comforted to be in the presence of her teacher. It took almost an hour to get everyone checked and make sure they had all spoken to the police. But when it was all over with, the teachers ushered them to the bus and took off for Musutafu District. A few students slept on the ride back, fully exhausted by everything they'd been through, but most stayed vigilant. The collective gazes of the students passing over the entire bus for the duration of the drive, counting their classmates, making sure the few who were asleep were still breathing. On edge would be an understatement to say the least. The tension in the bus would need a saw to cut through. As the bus stopped down the uneven dirt roads, a small handful of students in the back of the bus were whispering about something, unbeknownst to their friends. They were planning to get their hero back, vowing that they would, at any cost. Deku would be brought home, and the League would suffer. Alright everybody, that concludes Part 1, Chapter 1 of Through the Eyes of a Quirkless Child. Please make sure to join the Discord if you haven't already, if you would like to get updates easier, get connected with people within the fanfiction community, make requests for a podfic, and more. The link to the server will be in the description. Now, I hope you enjoyed, and thank you for listening.